At 16, they gave me a thin envelope and a bus ticket, telling me I was free. But freedom just felt like being thrown away. What I found in a forgotten corner of the country, inside a metal shed I bought for $15, wasn't just a home. It was a history I never knew I had. If a story like this is something you need to hear right now, if you've ever felt like you were starting from scratch with nothing but the clothes on your back, then I want a subscribe button and stick around. What I learned in that cold, empty place might be something you can use too. The day it all changed was a Tuesday in late October. The sky over the city was the color of a dirty dishcloth, low and heavy with the promise of a winter that didn't care if you were ready for it. I stood on the top step of the Northwood Group Home for Boys, the only home I'd known for the last 4 years. The air was sharp, and I could feel the cold concrete through the worn soles of my boots. My entire life was packed into a single black duffel bag that was cutting into my shoulder. Inside was one change of clothes, a worn paperback, a toothbrush, and a manila envelope that felt both impossibly heavy and completely weightless. Mrs. Gable, my case manager, stood in the doorway. She wasn't a bad person, just tired. Her face was a permanent mask of strained sympathy, the kind you see on people who have to deliver bad news for a living. Her job was to process kids like me, to move us from one box on a spreadsheet to another. Today, I was moving to the closed column. "Leo," she said, her voice flat. She held out the thin paper envelope. "This is it, your final disbursement, $250, and the bus ticket. It leaves in an hour." I took it. The paper felt flimsy, unreal. $250. It sounded like a lot of money, but I knew it was nothing. It was severance pay for a childhood. It was just enough to get you out of their sight, just enough so they could say they didn't leave you with empty pockets. "And the other thing?" I asked, my own voice sounding distant, like it was coming from someone else. She sighed, a little puff of white in the cold air. She reached back inside the office and came back with a single folded piece of legal paper, yellowed at the creases. "This, the addendum from your grandfather's estate. It's all been processed. The title transfer is filed with the county clerk up there. It's yours." I looked at the paper. It was a bill of sale for one Quonset hut located on a 5-acre parcel in rural Braxton County. The price? $15. A fee I'd paid a month ago to a lawyer I'd never met, using a money order I'd bought with cash, saved from mopping floors at the home. $15. It was the most absurd and terrifying thing I had ever owned. "Thank you," I said. The words were automatic, useless. Mrs. Gable gave a short, tight nod. "Be safe, Leo. Try to make good choices." It was the same thing she said to every kid who left. It was a prayer and a dismissal all in one. She didn't hug me. They never did. Physical contact was a liability. She just retreated back into the warm building, and the heavy door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing down the empty concrete steps. And just like that, it was over. 4 years of bells telling you when to wake up, when to eat, when to sleep. 4 years of weekly counseling sessions where you learned to say the right things without feeling any of them. 4 years of being a case file, a problem to be managed. Now, I was just me. A 16-year-old boy on a sidewalk, holding a bus ticket to a place I'd never seen, and the deed to a metal shed I'd bought for the price of 3 fast food meals. I turned and walked away from the building, not looking back. There was nothing to look back at. The city bus was waiting at the corner, its diesel engine rumbling impatiently. I climbed on, paid my fare from the cash in the envelope, and found a seat by a window smeared with grime. As the bus pulled away from the curb, I watched the gray buildings of the city slide by. I felt nothing, not sadness, not excitement, not even fear, just a deep, hollow emptiness. I was a ghost leaving a graveyard. The bus was my hearse, driving me not to a final resting place, but to whatever came next. And I had no idea what that was. I just knew it was cold, and it was a long way away. The bus merged onto the highway, and I leaned my head against the vibrating glass, the hum of the road a monotonous lullaby for the first day of the rest of my life. The bus ride was 18 hours long, broken up by 2 transfers in dingy, fluorescent-lit depots that all smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. I didn't sleep. I just watched the world change outside my window. The sprawling cityscape gave way to suburbs, then to farmland that was flat and brown, the harvest long since finished. Then the land started to ripple, to swell into hills that grew into mountains, cloaked in pine and skeletal hardwoods. The farther north we went, the more the colors seemed to drain from the world, leaving only shades of gray, brown, and the stark white of early snow dusting the higher elevations. I kept my duffel bag on my lap, my hand resting on the manila envelope inside. It contained my birth certificate, my social security card, and the strange bill of sale for the Quonset hut. It felt like the documentation for a new identity, one I hadn't chosen, but was now stuck with. 16 and legally emancipated. It was a loophole, a strange provision my grandfather had set up years before he died. He was a man I barely remembered, a ghost from my early childhood. My parents, before they were gone, spoke of him as a difficult, eccentric recluse. After they died in the accident, he was my only living relative. But he hadn't taken me in. Instead, he had set up a trust. It paid for the group home. It paid for Mrs. Gable's salary. It paid for my existence as a ward of the state, but at arm's length. I used to hate him for it. Lying in my bunk at Northwood, I'd imagine him living in some mansion, forgetting he even had a grandson. I pictured him as a cruel old man who couldn't be bothered. When he died 2 years ago, I felt a bitter, empty satisfaction. The lawyer handling his estate had sent a letter to the home. It said the trust would continue until my 18th birthday, or until I was legally emancipated. It also mentioned the addendum, the bizarre offer of the property in Braxton County, a final, strange puzzle from a man I never understood. Mrs. Gable had explained it to me in her sterile office. Your grandfather's will stipulates that you can be declared a mature minor at 16, Leo. It's an unusual provision, but it's legally sound. It means you'd be on your own. The trust would be dissolved. You'd get a small final payment, and the property would be yours if you accepted the terms. The terms were simple. I had to formally request the emancipation myself, and I had to pay the $15 transfer fee for the Quonset hut. It was a test, she'd said, a way out. Or you can stay here for 2 more years, she'd finished, her eyes holding no judgment. It's your choice. 2 more years of bells and rules and being someone's problem. 2 more years of feeling like I was living in a waiting room. I chose the Quonset hut. I chose the unknown. At least the unknown was mine. Mrs. Gable hadn't tried to talk me out of it. She just nodded and processed the paperwork. She was a cog in the system, and the system didn't care about the why. It only cared about the procedure. The last bus dropped me off at a gas station with a single pump and a convenience store whose windows were covered in dusty beer signs. The sign above the door just said, "Get and go." The sun was setting, painting the bruised-looking clouds in pale shades of orange and purple. The air was colder here, cleaner. It smelled of pine and damp earth and snow. "This is it for you, son," the bus driver said, heaving my duffel out of the storage compartment. "Braxton County line. The town's another 5 miles down that road." He pointed a thumb down a 2-lane blacktop that disappeared into the darkening woods. "Is there a cab? Another bus?" I asked. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're looking at the only bus that comes through here, and it's heading back south. You'll be walking." He climbed back into the bus, and with a hiss of air brakes, he was gone, leaving me alone in the growing twilight. The silence was immense. Back in the city, there was always a noise. Sirens, traffic, the hum of a million lives pressing in on you. Here, the silence was a physical presence. It was broken only by the sigh of the wind in the tall pines that lined the road and the distant caw of a crow. I pulled the folded legal paper from my pocket. It included a hand-drawn map. My grandfather's handwriting was spiky and angular, like chicken scratch. It showed the gas station, the road, and a turnoff about 3 miles down. "Look for the fallen oak," the note said. "Gravel path, 1 mile in." I zipped up my thin jacket, pulled my beanie down over my ears, and slung the duffel over my shoulder. The strap dug in, a familiar discomfort. I looked down the long, dark road. There were no streetlights, no houses in sight, just the endless black trunks of the trees standing like sentinels. For the first time, a sliver of real fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness. This was it. No more safety nets. No more group home. No more Mrs. Gable. It was just me, the woods, and a $15 shed at the end of a gravel road. I took a deep breath, the icy air burning my lungs, and I started to walk. Every step took me further away from the only life I knew, and deeper into a future I couldn't even begin to imagine. The weight on my shoulder felt heavier with every yard. The 5 miles to the town of Braxton felt more like 10. My boots, already worn, rubbed blisters onto my heels. The sun disappeared completely, and the world became a tunnel of darkness, illuminated only by the weak beam of the cheap flashlight I'd bought at the last bus depot. The woods on either side of the road were a wall of black, alive with sounds I couldn't identify. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the low hoot of an owl. Every noise made the hair on my arms stand up. I wasn't used to this kind of wildness. My world had been concrete and chain-link fences. The town, when I finally reached it, wasn't much. A single main street with a few dozen buildings, most of them dark. A courthouse with a lit-up clock tower. A diner with a buzzing neon sign. A small grocery store, and a bar from which I could hear the faint sound of music and laughter. I was exhausted and hungry, the last of my snacks gone hours ago. I went into the grocery store. The bell above the door chimed, and an old man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. His eyes narrowed with the casual suspicion small towns reserve for strangers. I bought a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bottle of water. The total came to more than I expected. My $250 was already starting to feel small. I ate standing outside on the sidewalk, tearing off chunks of bread and scooping the peanut butter out with my fingers. It was the best meal I'd ever had. I found the turnoff my grandfather's map described about an hour later. It was marked by a huge, lightning-splintered oak tree that leaned wearily over the road. A gravel path, barely wider than a car, snaked away into the darkness. It was even darker here, away from the faint glow of the town. I hesitated, my flashlight beam dancing nervously over the ruts and potholes of the path. This was the final step. Down this path was my new life, or the end of it. I pushed aside the fear and started walking again. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots. The path was rough, and I stumbled several times. It climbed steadily uphill, and my lungs ached in the thin, cold air. After what felt like another hour, the path opened into a clearing, and there it was. It was bigger than I'd imagined, a long, curved arch of corrugated metal, like the back of a giant metallic beetle half buried in the earth. It was rusted in huge, weeping patches, the color of dried blood. Weeds and small saplings grew thick around its base. One of the large sliding doors at the front was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its track. It looked derelict, abandoned, a monument to forgotten things. This was my inheritance, my $15 home. A wave of despair, so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet, washed over me. What had I done? I had traded a warm bed and 3 meals a day, no matter how institutional, for this. A rusted metal shell in the middle of nowhere. The wind whistled through a gap in the metal, a mournful, lonely sound. I wanted to turn around, to walk back to the town, to get on a bus and go. Where? There was nowhere to go. This was the end of the line. My hand was shaking as I approached the crooked door. I put my shoulder to it and pushed. It screeched in protest, the sound of metal grinding on rusted metal, but it moved. It opened just enough for me to slip through. The air inside was colder than outside, and it held the thick, musty smell of damp, decay, and mouse droppings. My flashlight beam cut a weak path through the cavernous darkness. The space was huge, much larger than it looked from the outside. The curved ceiling was lost in shadows high above me. The floor was concrete, cracked and littered with debris. Piles of junk were everywhere, rotted wooden crates, rusted machine parts, stacks of old tires, and unidentifiable shapes shrouded in dusty tarps. It looked like someone had been using it as a dumping ground for 50 years and then walked away. I swept the light around the space. It was a tomb, a cold, forgotten place, and it was mine. I walked deeper inside, my footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. In the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of crumbling pallets, was a single, olive-drab military footlocker. It was the only thing in the entire place that didn't look like trash. It was clean, solid, and secured with a heavy-duty padlock. My heart started beating a little faster. What was in it? Money? Some kind of treasure my eccentric grandfather had left for me? Hope, fragile and foolish, flickered in my chest. I set my duffel bag down. I was home. Or at least, I was at the address. The difference between the two felt like 1,000,000 miles. I sank down onto the dusty concrete floor, my back against the cold metal wall of the hut. And for the first time since I'd left Northwood, I let the full weight of my situation crush me. I was 16 years old, alone in a rusted-out shed in the woods, with a locked box and a rapidly dwindling supply of hope. The first night in the Quonset was the longest night of my life. I didn't have a sleeping bag, just the thin jacket and the clothes I was wearing. I found a relatively clean corner, swept away the worst of the dirt and debris with my boot, and curled up on the concrete floor with my duffel bag as a pillow. The cold was a living thing. It seeped up from the ground, through my clothes, and settled deep in my bones. I shivered uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw ached. Every creak of the metal hut, every gust of wind that rattled the loose door, sounded like a threat. I lay there in the pitch black, listening, waiting for morning, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. When dawn finally came, it was a weak, gray light filtering through the grime on the few small windows high up on the curved walls. I was stiff, sore, and numb with cold, but I was alive. That felt like a small victory. My first priority was the footlocker. It was the only thing in this whole mess that felt like it held a purpose. The padlock was thick and sturdy. I had no key. I spent the better part of an hour searching the junk piles for something to use as a pry bar. I finally found a long, heavy piece of rebar. It was clumsy, but it was all I had. I wedged the end of it into the padlock's hasp and threw all my weight against it. The metal groaned. I pushed again, my muscles screaming in protest. With a sudden loud crack, the hasp snapped. My hands were trembling as I lifted the heavy lid of the footlocker. I peered inside, my breath held tight in my chest. There was no treasure, no stacks of cash, no gold bars. My heart sank. The top layer was a neatly folded wool blanket, military issue, thick and scratchy. Beneath it were several large cans of food, beans, stew, peaches, and a can opener. There was a small camp stove with a full fuel canister, a first aid kit, a heavy-duty flashlight, much better than my own, with a package of fresh batteries, and a set of basic high-quality tools, a hammer, a set of screwdrivers, a wrench, a handsaw. It was practical. It was survival. It was disappointing. I had been hoping for a miracle, a magic solution. This was just stuff. Useful stuff, sure, but it wasn't going to fix the gaping hole that was my life. And then I saw it. At the very bottom of the locker, lying flat, was a thick 9 by 12 manila envelope, sealed with a strip of heavy-duty tape. My name, Leo, was written on the front in that same spiky, angular handwriting from the map. This was it. This was the real inheritance. I sat down on the dusty floor, my back against the cold footlocker, and carefully slit the envelope open with the blade of the can opener. Inside were two things. The first was a slim stack of documents held together with a paperclip. The official deed to the 5-acre property, free and clear, in my name. A soil survey, a plat map. The second was a letter. It was 20 pages long, handwritten on yellow legal paper. It began simply, "Dear Leo, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found your way here. I hope the journey was not too difficult. I also hope you are not too angry with me." I stopped. My throat felt tight. I took a deep breath and continued reading. The letter was my grandfather's voice, speaking to me from across the years, and it unraveled the entire story of my life. He explained that my parents had not died in a simple car accident. They had gotten involved with dangerous people, a loan sharking operation that was part of a larger criminal network. They had owed a lot of money, and their deaths were not accidental. They were a message. The people they owed money to had made it clear that their debt would be passed on to any next of kin. To me. "I couldn't take you in, Leo," he wrote. "It would have been a death sentence for us both. They would have found us. The only way to keep you safe was to make you disappear, to hide you in the one place they would never look, the foster care system. A state ward has no assets, no family to extort. You became a ghost. It was the hardest decision I have ever made, to let you go, to let you think I had abandoned you. It was a choice between your happiness and your life. I chose your life. I pray every day that someday you will understand and forgive me." I had to stop reading. The words blurred through a sudden film of tears. The anger and resentment I had carried for him for years, a hard, bitter stone in my chest, began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of shock and a grief so profound it felt like I was drowning. He hadn't abandoned me. He had saved me. All those years I had felt thrown away. I had actually been protected, hidden in plain sight. I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and forced myself to keep reading. He went on to explain the Quonset hut. He had bought the land and the hut cheap after he got out of the army. It was his own escape, a place to be left alone. He knew the criminal organization that had taken my parents had a long memory, but their primary motivation was money. They wouldn't bother with a destitute orphan. The trust I set up was a decoy, he wrote. Enough to keep you cared for, but not enough to attract attention. The emancipation at 16 was your escape hatch, a way for you to get out of the system and claim your own life before you became an adult, before they might start looking for you again. This place, this land, this ugly metal shed, this is your head start. It's not much, but it's yours. No one can take it from you. The world thinks you are a charity case, a boy with nothing. Let them think it. What you have here is better than money. It's a place to stand your ground. The last part of the letter was about the hut itself. He described its flaws, the leaks in the roof, the poor insulation. And then he gave instructions. There is a loose floorboard in the northwest corner, right where the wall starts to curve. Pry it up. What's underneath is for you. It's not a fortune, just the seed money I could squirrel away over the years without anyone noticing. Use it to make this place a home. Don't sell it, Leo. Don't run. Build something. Character is not what you are given. It's what you build from the scraps you have. This is your scrap. Make it a fortress. The letter ended with a final, heartbreaking line. I'm sorry I couldn't be the grandfather you deserved. I hope you can build the life you deserve. I love you, kid. I dropped the pages onto my lap. A sob, raw and ragged, tore its way out of my throat. It was a sound I hadn't made in years. I cried. I cried for the parents I barely remembered, their memory now tainted with a new, darker tragedy. I cried for the lonely little boy in the group home who thought his own grandfather didn't want him. And I cried for the old man who had lived with the terrible secret, who had made an impossible choice and died alone, hoping his grandson would one day understand. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of that rusted, forgotten hut, surrounded by junk and decay, and I cried until I had no tears left. The sun had climbed higher, and a single bright beam of light shone through a grimy window, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It landed on the letter in my lap. The despair I had felt was gone. The fear was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer the fear of being alone and abandoned. It was the fear of failure, the fear of not being able to live up to the faith this man, this stranger who was my grandfather, had placed in me. I looked around the vast, empty space. I saw it differently now. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a tomb. It was a starting line. It was a promise. It was a challenge. And in the silent, cold air of the Quonset hut, I made a choice. I would not run. I would not sell. I would stay. I would build. The weight of my grandfather's letter, of his sacrifice, settled on me. It was a heavy burden, the heaviest thing I had ever carried. But for the first time in my life, it felt like a burden I was meant to carry. My life was no longer a random series of unfortunate events. It had a story. It had a purpose. And it started right here, in this cold, empty place. Listen, If you've made it this far into my story, I want to take a second to talk to you directly. Maybe you've had a moment like this in your life, a moment where the entire world shifts under your feet, where a truth you thought you knew turns out to be a lie, and you're left standing in the rubble, trying to figure out what's real. It's a terrifying, disorienting feeling. It can break you, or it can be the single most powerful catalyst for change you will ever experience. That letter from my grandfather broke me open, but it also gave me a blueprint. It gave me a reason. Have you ever had a moment like that? A piece of information, a conversation, a discovery that changed everything. If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd love to read about finding strength when you feel like you have none left. Your stories matter here. Thank you for listening. Now let's get back to what happened next. After the tears dried, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, resolute clarity. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. Build something. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, a legacy. I stood up, my joints stiff from the cold and from sitting on the concrete for so long. The first step was to find what he had hidden. I walked to the northwest corner of the hut, the part that curved down to meet the foundation. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt and debris. I used a piece of scrap wood to scrape it away, revealing the cracked concrete beneath. I ran my hands over the floor, feeling for any incongruity. And there it was. One section, about 2 feet square, didn't feel like solid concrete. It felt like wood, disguised with a thin layer of cement wash and dirt. I took the pry bar from my tool haul and worked the tip into a hairline crack. With a sharp tug, a section of the floor came loose. Beneath it was a hollow space, and nestled inside was a small steel ammunition box. It was heavy. I lifted it out and set it on the floor. Unlike the footlocker, this was unlocked. I opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick bundle of cash. It was all 20s and 50s, held together with rubber bands. I didn't count it right away. Just seeing it made my head spin. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. Beside the money was another manila envelope. This one contained a series of hand-drawn schematics and diagrams, meticulously detailed. The title was written at the top in my grandfather's blocky letters. Off-Grid Power and Water System, Basic. There were drawings for a simple rainwater collection system routing runoff from the curved roof into a filtration barrel. There were plans for a wood-burning stove, showing how to safely install a flue through the metal wall. And most importantly, there was a multi-page guide on installing a small-scale solar power system. It listed the components needed: panels, a charge controller, a battery bank, an inverter. He had even included a list of mail-order catalogs from the era, companies that specialized in off-grid living supplies. Tucked into the back of the schematics was one final small note. Kid, this money should be enough for the basics. The panels are the most important part. Light and power are what separate a shelter from a home. They are what keep the darkness at bay, both outside and in. Don't be afraid of the work. You come from strong stock. You're smarter than you think. The instructions are all here. Read them. Then read them again. Measure twice, cut once. You can do this. Build something that lasts. Your life. I carefully packed everything back into the ammo box. The money, the plans. This was my arsenal. This was my war chest for the battle ahead. The battle against the cold, against the decay, against the loneliness. My first trip back to town was a different experience. I was no longer a lost, frightened kid. I was a man with a mission. I walked the 5 miles with a purpose. I went to the small public library and spent a whole day reading. I read books on basic construction, on wiring, on insulation. I looked up the modern equivalents of the mail order companies my grandfather had listed. The internet was a miracle. I found forums of people living off-grid, sharing advice and encouragement. I was alone in the woods, but I wasn't the only one. My next stop was the hardware store. The same old man was behind the counter. He watched me as I walked the aisles, pulling items from the shelves. Heavy-duty cleaning supplies, buckets, thick work gloves, a good respirator mask, caulk guns, and tubes of industrial sealant. "Big project?" he asked as he rang me up. His tone was still gruff, but the suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "Something like that," I said. "Fixing up an old place out past the fallen oak." He grunted. "The old Miller Quonset. Thought that place was going to fall in on itself years ago. You're the grandson, then. Heard you were coming." Small towns. News traveled fast. "Yeah," I said. "That's me." He finished tallying the total. It took a significant chunk of my first $100. "Well, good luck to you, son," he said, and there was a hint of something new in his voice. Maybe respect. "It's a hell of a lot of work." The work was brutal. The first week was just cleaning. I put on the respirator and the gloves and went to war with 50 years of filth. I hauled out mountains of junk, rotten wood, rusted metal, broken glass. I filled dozens of heavy-duty trash bags with debris. I fought nests of mice and spiders. I scrubbed the concrete floor with bleach and water until my arms felt like they were going to fall off. The screech of metal as I dragged junk across the floor was deafening. Every night I would collapse onto my wool blanket, every muscle aching, my body covered in a layer of grime, too tired to even eat. But every morning I woke up and did it again. Slowly, painstakingly, the hut began to transform. As I cleared the clutter, the sheer scale of the space became apparent. It was like a cathedral of corrugated steel. For the first time, I could see its potential, not just its decay. Once it was clean, I started on the repairs. I spent days up on a rickety ladder, patching holes in the metal roof and walls, with sealant and small squares of sheet metal I bought in town. I sealed every seam, every bolt hole, every crack I could find. It was tedious, frustrating work. More than once I nearly gave up, overwhelmed by the scale of the task. But then I would think of my grandfather's letter, "Build something that lasts," and I would pick up my caulk gun and get back to work. The biggest challenge was the insulation. The bare metal walls radiated cold. The library had books on insulating Quonset huts, and I followed the instructions to the letter. I ordered huge rolls of foil-backed foam insulation online, having them delivered to the Get and Go, the only place in town that would accept packages for a fee. The hardware store owner let me borrow his truck for an afternoon to haul it all back to my property. He didn't ask for money, just told me to have it back by 5. It was a small kindness, but it felt huge. Sticking the insulation to the curved walls was a nightmare. It was awkward and unwieldy. I had to cut each piece to fit the curve, wrestling with it overhead, my arms aching. But as the white, foil-covered panels went up, the space was transformed. It became brighter, the foil reflecting the weak light. And it became quieter. The sound of the wind outside was muffled. The acoustics inside softened. It was starting to feel less like a shed and more like a room. A very, very big room. The final and most important project was the solar panels. This was the part that scared me the most. It involved money, technology, and the risk of catastrophic failure. I spent weeks studying my grandfather's diagrams and cross-referencing them with modern tutorials online. I ordered a starter kit, 2 large panels, a charge controller, 4 deep-cycle batteries, and a small inverter. It was the single biggest expense, eating up a huge portion of my remaining cash. The day the boxes arrived was nerve-wracking. I carefully unpacked every component, laying them out on the clean concrete floor like the pieces of a sacred puzzle. I built a wooden rack for the panels on the south-facing side of the hut, angling them just as the instructions dictated. I drilled a hole through the wall for the wiring, my heart pounding with the fear of messing it up. I mounted the controller and the inverter on a board on the wall inside. I connected the batteries. The final step was connecting the panels to the charge controller. I checked my wiring one last time, my grandfather's hand-drawn diagrams spread out on the floor. Measure twice, cut once. I had measured a dozen times. I took a deep breath and made the final connection. A small green light on the charge controller flickered, then glowed steady. It was working. The panels were gathering sunlight. The batteries were charging. I had saved one last purchase for this moment, a single light socket on a cord and a single 60-watt light bulb. I wired the cord to the inverter. I screwed the bulb into the socket. It was late afternoon, and the inside of the hut was sinking into its usual gloom. I stood in the center of the vast space, the cord in my hand. This was it, the culmination of months of back-breaking labor, of fear and hope and sheer, stubborn will. I took a breath, and I flipped the switch on the inverter. The bulb flickered, and then with a soft, warm hum, it glowed to life. A circle of clean, bright, beautiful light pushed back the shadows. It wasn't just a light bulb, it was a sun. It was a star that I had hung in my own private sky. It was proof that I could do it, proof that my grandfather was right. I stood there in the middle of my Quonset hut, bathed in the warm glow of that single naked bulb, and I laughed. It was a real laugh, loud and full of relief. The darkness was still there, waiting at the edges of the light, but it wasn't winning, not anymore. Months bled into a year. The first winter was hard. I installed the wood stove my grandfather had drawn, its warmth a constant, reassuring presence in the center of the hut. I learned the rhythm of splitting wood, of banking the fire at night, of waking up in a cold room and coaxing the embers back to life. I learned to be brutally efficient with my power, using the light only when I needed it, cherishing the energy stored in my batteries like a dragon hoarding gold. I ate a lot of canned beans and peanut butter sandwiches, but I survived. When spring came, it felt like a resurrection. The snow melted, the world turned green, and I felt like I was waking up from a long, dark dream. I used my grandfather's plat map and soil survey to choose a spot for a garden. I spent weeks turning over the soil, removing rocks and amending it with compost I had started from kitchen scraps and leaves. I planted seeds, potatoes, carrots, beans, tomatoes. Watching them sprout from the dark earth was a quiet miracle. It was more food. It was more life. The Quonset hut was no longer a shell. It was a home. I had partitioned off a small section with salvaged wood to create a cozy sleeping area. I built a simple kitchen counter with a dry sink that drained into a gravel pit outside. I had a small table and a chair I'd found at the town's yearly cleanup day. It was sparse. It was simple. But everything in it was something I had built or fixed or earned. I settled into a routine. I worked on the hut, always finding new small improvements to make. I tended my garden. I made weekly trips to town for supplies I couldn't grow or make. People in town had stopped looking at me like a stranger. They called me Leo. The hardware store owner, whose name was Frank, would ask about my solar setup, genuinely curious. The librarian, a woman named Sarah, would set aside books for me she thought I'd like. I wasn't one of them, not yet, but I wasn't an outsider anymore either. I was just the kid up at the old Miller place, the one who was making a go of it. One warm summer evening, I sat on a small wooden bench I had built outside the hut's entrance. The sun was setting, and the sky was a riot of color. The air was warm and smelled of pine and the damp earth of my garden. My solar panels were tilted toward the fading light, soaking up the last of the day's energy. Inside, my batteries were full. My pantry had jars of food I had grown myself. My home, my fortress of steel and insulation, was quiet and secure behind me. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about his definition of inheritance. For most of my life, I thought inheritance was about money, about being given things. I was wrong. His gift to me wasn't the cash in the ammo box. It wasn't even the land or the hut. His gift was the challenge. The inheritance was the work itself. He hadn't given me a home. He had given me the opportunity to build one. He hadn't given me a life. He had given me the tools and the space to create my own. He wrote that character is what you build from the scraps you have. I looked at my hands. They were calloused and stained with dirt. They were the hands of a builder. I looked at the Quonset hut, its rusted metal skin glowing in the sunset. It was a scrap, a piece of junk left to rot in the woods. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I hadn't just built a home. I had built a life. I had built a future. More importantly, I had rebuilt my past. I was no longer Leo, the abandoned kid from the group home. I was Leo, the boy who had been protected, the boy who had been trusted with a legacy. My story wasn't about being kicked out. It was about being sent on a mission. And as I sat there, listening to the crickets start their evening song, I finally felt like I was at peace. The road to get here had been harder than I could have ever imagined, but for the first time, I felt truly, unshakably free. The silence of the woods was no longer threatening. It was just quiet. And it was mine. So that's my story, or at least the beginning of it. The journey from that first cold night on a concrete floor to a life of self-sufficiency and peace. It taught me that home isn't a place you find, it's a place you make. It's not about four walls and a roof. It's about purpose, resilience, and the quiet pride of building something with your own two hands. It's about taking the broken pieces you're given and creating something whole. What did this story teach you? What does the word home mean to you? I build a community around the things that really matter. If you believe in second chances, in the power of rolling up your sleeves and getting to work, in finding hope, my story is just one story. I know there are thousands of others out there, just as powerful, just as important, and I want to hear them. I want you to know that whatever you're building, you're not building it alone. Thank you for being here.